Welcome, guys. It's good to have you back and participate in this ensemble of good ideas. Maybe some bad ones, but at least we can try. Um, I want to discuss this concept that permeates a lot of my writing and I think is somewhat essential in contemporary lifestyle and experience. I would say first the reason it's essential is because the um, the manner in which we deal with the infrastructural realm, the realm that is existent in front of us, what perception meets without any criteria other than us facing it, is somewhat become opened and complex, such that navigation is part of the successful life in the new age. It was possible in previous eras to navigate haphazardly and find themselves free from any constraints, but because of the space problem, navigation becomes part of the repertoire of good existence. First, we need to clarify two major categories. One is the center urban settings, and we have to define that. And then there's the marginalized, the suburbia, the things that are dependent on the center. Now, before we begin an argumentation of what is considered what, it's important to note that the dependency is complex. It might appear that one is self-sufficient, right? So self-sufficiency is a complicated subject. The ancient philosophers lived in this concept, and it's almost been accepted for the modern definition without further elaboration. Aristotle, for example, noted that the good city, the good life is self-sufficient. So in our modern interpretation of self-sufficiency as responsibility, right? As one of the contemporary philosophers, I'm not sure who, it's not coming to mind at the moment, he said that responsibility is the responsibility response to existential disarray, existential disruption. So we're not responding to people, systems, or reality as you would construe it, but it's rather much more laden in some deep concept, so that we can notice this when we accept that someone up to the age of, let's say, 60 has a responsibility towards society, and somehow after 60 there's no responsibility. So if it is some sort of concept of human socio-economic connection or some sort of societal process, then what should change? What society decides who's fit and who's not fit. If it's the essential, we would demand maybe a less degree, but we wouldn't retire one who's over 60, or 70. But if you understand the concept as it were, as it's meant to be, that it's responding to the existential disruption of individuality, which we're all dealing with, which is essential to life, then it is not society. Society is the added system, the framework to reference and bridge the existential background or the disruption, but it is in no effect the true nature of what we're responding to. We're responding to the almost oceanic liquid state, which requires the molded settling of structure and system. But anyway, back to our discussion. So the self-sufficient city is one which is the dominant bearing of, it's the father to the child. It's the progenitor to the marginalized aspects. Now, it would be commonplace for one to assume wherever they reside as to be the self-sufficient center, because who would want to dictate that their entire surrounding is but a marginalized system? Yet that very notion of humility is the point of conjecture for possibility in growth, and it's more than growth. It's getting the right information. That the truth of the matter is that if we're getting the wrong information, the wrong input of information, then whatever decision, whatever manifestation of that, it's just based on inaccuracy, and it's not factual. And so we only need to look so far as when a location or a system gets disrupted or detached from its origin, to notice that it somehow feels like an island, right? If you walk into a major city and then somehow there's a disruption of the outside realm, all the marginalized, it wouldn't be experienced within that domain as somehow disruptive in its innate process. In fact, the disruption in the center locations are based on its internal process, right? So let's say a major blackout, for example, or something that disrupts its own mechanisms from continuing, right? It's not the dependency. And in fact, if you look the other way and you take a marginalized location and you take out the power or whatever, and now there's a blackout, it wouldn't be experienced as sort of a disruption from its connection to what is beyond it. In fact, it creates a dynamic where it's almost more it's more connected, it's more attached to what's beyond it because it doesn't have its own power. It's almost like the veil has been removed and now there's an opening to agree to what it is. But at the same time, if there is some sort of storm or, separation of political powers or whatever creates a real separation between locations, all of a sudden it will be experienced in this disparaging way, this feeling of complete isolation from reality or the world at large, which is the opposite in these centric locations. So it is really the study of the experiential, meaning the human experience through the perceptual process of these domains, that it makes for a understanding of what realm we're dealing with. And the importance of understanding these two criteria is that the social behavior in each are completely different, like night and day. Because when one is in these marginalized domains, they have a certain access to their psyche. It's almost like they've unlocked a personal realm of the psyche, which is completely closed in the realm of these centric locations. The reason it becomes open is because the perceptual data, the infrastructural data stream that allows for the psyche to continue its system of internalization, that process is only is reliant on weakened data. And if it's in the desert, in outside a political realm, outside any sort of system, conceptual system, then it truly is lost to most of the perceptual data stream, something novel and new, and therefore the internalization of the psyche relies on its internal basis. Now we argue in other works the idea that there is no personal basis because it is based on a previous memory of a perceptual experience, but that's a side point. The point is that there is an access to be had when the perceptual data is weakened and is less self-sufficient. Now, the opposite is true in the centric locations because, in fact, one has no access to the personal realm. The personal realm is almost off limits because there is so much novel information that continuously bombards the perceptual arena of the psyche that there is no way to just put a barrier and then just access the personal realm outside of that, because the personal internal mechanism is completely bound to the perceptual process. And even if somehow somebody would enclose themselves just by having the political understanding of and how it is connected to these complex infrastructural realms, would have one not be able to access the psyche. I think of prisons in centric locations as such. Like, I mean, this is a populace that is locked up, that doesn't have access to anything other than a very distinct domain. They see the same four walls, the same mess hall, and that's it. And their schedule is processed completely in sync with what was previously done, and so there's no novelty at all. Yet, because it is bound in this centric location, it becomes affected to the point where the personal realm is still inaccessible, despite it could be years, it could be half a lifetime, and yet one will not have that access unless they are politically and infrastructural separated. Now, this begins the philosophical question of and how is that connected? How does that remain connected? So there's the political connection, right? It's politically oriented. It's locationally connected. Now, even if we removed it, if somebody was convinced for some reason it's outside the political realm that they thought it was, and even if they were convinced that it's outside the location that it was proposed to be, even if such were the case, there is, I would say, an infinite amount of data access points that go against that notion. Even the slightest, even in solitary confinement in which there is no interaction and the four walls continue, I think it would still process, even if we would remove every fly, every sort of organism that would propose itself in sync with what's occurring outside of it, I would think that there would be something that would enter that domain. And yes, I think it would be probable of a scientific endeavor to approach that and see if we can. But first, we would need to set a scientific criteria of the difference. But once we do that, then we could study the eventual ability, if possible, of separating infrastructurally to a point where one has access to their psyche as though they are in a desert. It's difficult to believe that it is possible, but just by the fact that it's so difficult to claim such a thing means that the differentiation is so strong, and therefore the orientation or the navigation of one's being is so reliant on these systems that any deviation would be a wrongful influx of information, right? If you assume that the marginalized is the center and therefore that data is somehow truer than what's beyond it, that's degeneracy in itself, because it's not self-sufficient. Or in the centric location, to believe that one has access to the personal realm, or that they can be personable, right? They could be somehow enduring a private relationship. That's also a realm of degeneracy. And it's interesting because as I speak this, it sounds so novel and so against the grain of contemporary understanding. But if one would just go back 2 generations, speak to someone who flourished in the 1950s, this sort of concept, although it wasn't articulated, and maybe that was their fault, but they would have an intuitive understanding of this. The entire infrastructure proceeded based on this. The entire notion of post-World War II suburbia was based on this process. And so because of that, we are not speaking of ideas that are novel, but rather just re-articulating something that has been missing from contemporary articulation more than contemporary intuitive understandings. Thanks for your time, guys.